Never before, not since the huge armored clashes of the Second World War, have so many different models of tanks fought side by side as they have in Ukraine. And the results have been brutal. Some tanks on this battlefield have been little more than rolling caskets, pushed straight into drone-watched minefields where survival is measured in minutes. Others have been forced into roles they were never designed for, acting as static fire support or improvised artillery because advancing means instant detection and destruction. And then there are the exceptions, machines that have proven remarkably resilient even under the relentless pressure of unjammable drones, loitering munitions, top attack warheads, and precision artillery. I'm Tuomas, a former officer of the Finnish Defense Forces, and in this first episode of our new series on how military equipment has actually performed in Ukraine, we're looking at the previous king of land warfare, the tank. Not tanks in theory, not what the fans of specific models promised, but the actual machines that have fought, burned, survived, and been rebuilt on the Ukrainian front. On the Russian side, that includes everything from T-55s and T-62s dragged out of deep storage to the backbone T-72 and T-80 fleets, and right up to the T-90M. Many of these have been thrown into some of the harshest armor-killing conditions in modern history, where poor coordination, dense minefields, and constant drone surveillance have resulted in extreme loss rates, where estimates now puts the Russian tank inventory at below replacement level, especially among older Soviet-era models. On the Ukrainian side, we've seen the Polish upgraded PT-91 Twardy, the now incredibly mad-maxed upgraded Leopard 1A5, and the Western heavy hitters, Leopard 2A4 and 6, Stridsvagn 122, Challenger 2, and the American Abrams. In this episode, we'll break down how these tanks have evolved in this war, how they've been used, and most importantly how they've survived, or failed, and, as requested by our community, where each tank family lands on our scale from fail to A+, based on real battlefield evidence. And while many of these tanks have passionate fan bases, people who cherry-pick footage and push biased narratives, we're going to be attempting to cut through that noise. We're going straight to geolocated, photo-confirmed losses, frontline video, and hard open-source analysis to find out which tank has actually come out on top out of the more than 10 models currently fighting in Ukraine. Before we can compare performance, we need to understand the scale of the armored war in Ukraine itself. Russia began the invasion with around 2,900 active main battle tanks and a massive Soviet-era stockpile behind them, as many as 17,000 tanks on paper, though most were decades old and have since been cannibalized for parts. Ukraine entered the war with hundreds of its own tanks, primarily T-64s made in Kharkiv, with smaller numbers of T-72s and T-80, and has steadily rebuilt its fleet with captured Russian vehicles and Western deliveries. All told, thousands of tanks have rotated through the front lines. Russia has committed far more than its original active fleet, while Ukraine has transformed its armored forces from a battered Soviet nucleus into a diverse mix of NATO-supplied systems. To track losses, we are going to rely on Oryx, a database that only counts equipment that is visually confirmed through photos or video. If there is no image, it doesn't count. Every tank logged is classified as destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured. It's a conservative count. The real numbers are likely higher, but it provides the clearest data we have, and both sides surveil pretty much every encounter on the battlefield through drones. And the picture is staggering. Russian losses, according to respected sources like the International Institute for Strategic Studies, are estimated at around 4,400 tanks destroyed or disabled since 2022. U.S. Defense Intelligence places the number of Russian tanks lost above 3,000 as part of a larger set of 10,000 destroyed ground vehicles. Oryx's confirmed numbers sit at around 3,700 visually verified Russian tank losses, and by November 2025, the aggregated confirmed total is well over 4,000. Russia has already lost nearly twice the amount of tanks in Ukraine than it had in active service before the invasion began. Ukrainian losses are smaller in absolute numbers, but devastating relative to their starting strength. As of December 1, 2025, Oryx lists 1,338 Ukrainian tanks destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured. That includes just over 1,000 destroyed, and as you'd expect, most of these losses have come to Ukraine's older Soviet model tanks, including well over 400 destroyed T-64s. For a military that started the war with only around 500 tanks ready for combat, this is an enormous turnover. Still, thanks to Western shipments and captured Russian equipment, Ukraine has kept its armored forces alive despite the attrition, and several sources estimate that Ukraine currently has a larger tank force than Russia, with more current active tanks than they started the war with. Combine the visually confirmed losses from both sides, and you get more than 5,000 tanks that we can assume are out of action. But a loss isn't always a loss, and once we get to some of the models towards the top of our grading list later, I'll tell you why. Once we zoom into the specific tank models, the picture becomes even clearer. On Russia's side, this war has quite frankly been an absolute catastrophe for almost every tank in its arsenal. The T-72 family alone has taken horrific losses. At least 1,783 T-72s, across all its variants, have been destroyed, abandoned, or captured since the invasion began. Many of these suffered catastrophic kills, turret blow-offs after ammunition cook-offs in the turret carousel, often following drone strikes or top-attack munitions. And it's not just the T-72. The T-62, once a backbone of earlier Soviet armored forces, has also been dragged out of storage and thrown into the grinder. As of late 2025, publicly available data shows that at least 308 T-62 tanks have been visually confirmed, lost, destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Next in line, the T-80 series has been mauled heavily as well, with over 1,000 confirmed losses, often during ill-prepared frontal assaults into drone-observed minefields around places like Vuhledar and Avdiivka, with over half of Russia's T-80 fleet being gone only a year into the war. Though, as with the T-72, Ukraine has been able to restock much of its own Soviet tank fleet by capturing over 10% of Russia's confirmed losses so far, meaning that Ukraine now has more T-80s than they did at the start of the war. Even the so-called top-shelf T-90M and its earlier variants have not escaped unharmed. Around 100 M variants and more than 150 T-90 in total have been lost, proving that even Russia's most modern tanks are vulnerable to very basic equipment. It is estimated that Russia's entire T-90 fleet has been destroyed in Ukraine, and the few that keep popping up are coming straight off of the production lines or stolen from countries like India, who sent their T-90 fleet to Russia for refurbishment before the start of the war. I'll give it to the Russians, though. Something the T-90 seems to be the best at is turret tossing. As of the making of this video, a T-90 leads the charts in this regard with a toss of over 200 meters into the air. So, to summarize before we move on to the Ukrainian inventory, all Russian tanks have seen a near 100% destruction rate. Generally, all models have been destroyed more times over than Russia had in its active inventory at the start of the war. Only if we include all of Russia's 300 T-90 of different variants, if we include storage at the start of the war, do we find a model which survives in small numbers, something along the lines of a 70% destruction rate. Though these claimed figures from Russia were likely not true. So, where should we rank the Russian tanks in our tier list based on this performance? Well, you'd be hard-pressed to rank any of them above F, but for the sake of the world champion in turret tossing, I'll put the T-90M with an extra volatile ammunition carousel and a slightly less horrid destruction rate at E for effort. One of the real underreported underdogs in Ukraine's armories is the PT-91 Twardy, a Polish upgraded evolution of the T-72 that fixes many of the original tank's biggest flaws. The PT-91 starts with the same Soviet hull, but adds thicker, modernized explosive protection, significantly improved optics and fire control, a stronger engine, and better crew ergonomics, essential upgrades for survival in a drone-saturated war. While Oryx's confirmed loss list shows 12 of 60 PT-91s destroyed, their losses are far lower than what we see among the various Russian models, which together make up the single largest block of visually confirmed tank losses in the entire conflict. And that's not surprising. Standard T-72 variants, especially older T-72As and Bs, suffer heavily from outdated optics, weaker armor packages, and the notorious vulnerability of their exposed ammunition carousel. By contrast, the PT-91's armor and sighting system give crews a fighting chance in conditions where older Soviet designs die quickly. It isn't a miracle tank. It still shares the T-72's basic layout and limitations. But in Ukraine's brutal conditions, the Twardy has shown itself to be a meaningfully more survivable and more effective platform than the baseline Soviet machines it evolved from. A whole unit of these tanks were at the tip of the spear of Ukraine's very successful Kursk offensive, and while 20% are visually confirmed destroyed, it has still offered Ukraine a better fighting chance than their original Soviet arsenal. One of the smaller contingents but consistently overperforming tanks in Ukraine is the Challenger 2. Even though Ukraine received only 14 of them, their battlefield record has stood out. Only 2 Challenger 2 has been visually confirmed destroyed, with a few others damaged but repairable, an unusually low loss rate in a conflict that has chewed through armor on an industrial scale. What makes the Challenger 2 so resilient is its Dorchester composite armor, the British evolution of the fabled Chobham armor. Ukrainian crews have remarked that the armor has already saved their lives after taking strikes that would have been lethal in older Soviet-designed tanks, as in, for example, this video where an FPV keeps trying to destroy an idle Challenger 2. Because of its exceptional protection and the accuracy of its 120mm rifled gun, Ukrainian units increasingly employ it as a long-range sniper tank, sitting in hull-down positions and delivering precise fire at distances where no enemy armor can reliably respond. Again, though, it's not a perfect tank. Its weight and modest power-to-weight ratio make it sluggish in Ukrainian mud during shoulder seasons, but within its strengths, it has proven to be one of the safest and most effective tanks currently serving on the Ukrainian side. Coming in at under 16% destruction rate, with the amount of use in a war of this magnitude, speaks volumes about the now old British main battle tank. One of the more interesting cases for Western tanks in Ukraine is the Stridsvagn 122, Sweden's heavily upgraded variant of the Leopard 2. It brings everything you'd expect from a modern Northern European design: excellent upgraded composite armor, strong protection against top attack threats, and a 120mm gun paired with high-quality optics. But what makes the Stridsvagn particularly noteworthy is the fog of misinformation surrounding its supposed losses in Ukraine. Throughout the war, Russian channels have repeatedly claimed that specific 122s were destroyed, only for the same turret numbers or identifiable features to reappear later in different footage, very much alive and operating. In fact, this has become a pattern. Videos circulate online announcing the destruction of Sweden's tanks, yet days or weeks later, more of them show up in Ukrainian hands than the claimed loss tallies would make possible. There have been a small number of confirmed hits, including at least one knocked-out hull early in its deployment, but far from the dramatic wipeouts frequently reported. Ukrainian crews appear to use the 122 carefully, leaning on its excellent armor and optics to fight from covered positions rather than pushing it into reckless assaults. As a result, the Swedish tank has quietly built a reputation as one of the most resilient and frustratingly hard-to-kill pieces of armor now operating in Ukraine, and out of the 10 donated, only 1 has been confirmed destroyed, giving it a mere 10% destruction rate even after being hammered by drones over and over. Perhaps more impressively, there has been at least 6 instances where it has been claimed that different tanks have been destroyed, so it appears that the Ukrainians, with Swedish help, are able to completely repair these tanks at an impressive rate. The backbone system in Ukraine's Western tank fleet is the Leopard 2, and it also happens to be the most numerous Western main battle tank family donated so far. The Leopard 2s arrived in 2 main groups, the older A4s and the newer, better protected A6s. Ukraine has received dozens of 2A4s from multiple European partners, with some countries becoming major donors as their own modernization cycles freed up older hulls. By 2023 to 2024, more than 70 Leopard 2s had already arrived, with additional batches continuing to flow through multinational procurement efforts. Alongside those, just over 20 Leopard 2A6s were delivered in the first wave, with more pledged later, making the Leopard 2 family the single largest cluster of Western heavy tanks now in Ukrainian service. On the loss side, Oryx's visual confirmation data gives us a clear snapshot of how hard these tanks have been worked. For the Leopard 2A4, Oryx lists 28 tanks knocked out in some manner, a mix of destroyed hulls, damaged vehicles, damaged and abandoned cases, and a small number damaged and captured. Only about half of those are total burnouts. The rest are mobility kills, artillery hits, or situations where crews bailed out under pressure, but the hull remained at least theoretically salvageable. For the Leopard 2A6, the numbers are smaller but still telling. 13 tanks documented as lost or damaged, again a combination of destroyed, damaged, abandoned, and captured vehicles. Considering the relatively small number of 2A6s delivered, this represents a significant share of the initial fleet and highlights the brutal conditions these tanks have been thrown into. On the battlefield, the pattern is familiar. The older A4s, with their earlier generation armor, tend to suffer more when exposed to mines, drones, and artillery, while the A6s, with improved frontal protection and the longer L55 gun, are often used more conservatively as long-range, fire support and counter-armor platforms. Survivability still depends heavily on tactics. When Leopard 2s are pushed into dense mine belts under drone observation, they get knocked out like anything else, in fact to a higher degree than the up-armored Challenger 2 and Stridsvagn. There's also, of course, other factors that come into play when we consider the relative higher loss ratios of the Leopard 2 models, one being that Ukraine considers them more expendable as there's more to come. The other being that they have not generally been placed with the specialist units like the airborne assault brigades that use the Challengers or the elite, so-called Swedish unit of the 21st Mechanized Brigade. Kraus Maffei Wegmann, who make the Leopard 2, will have noted that both models have a weakness in both the gear area and front, which has been an issue when hit by drones, which the thicker armor of the Swedish and British variants have prevented to a much larger degree. The last high-profile Western tank in Ukrainian service is the M1 Abrams, though its story has been far more complicated than many expected. Ukraine initially received 31 A1 variants from the United States, and this year has begun receiving another 49 from Australia. On paper, the Abrams brings superb optics, excellent long-range gunnery, and formidable frontal armor. But in practice, it has been dropped into one of the harshest tank-killing environments imaginable. The Abrams is a machine built for the U.S. Army, an army with enormous logistics, engineering support, recovery teams, air superiority, and fuel supplies behind it. Ukraine simply cannot provide the same ecosystem, and the loss figures show that. Oryx's visual confirmation data shows that the Abrams has taken significant punishment during its deployment, with roughly 20-plus vehicles listed as lost or damaged. Many are damaged or abandoned vehicles, left behind after overwhelming drone or artillery strikes when Ukraine failed in its southern counterattack in 2023, where a combination of heavy mud and drones forced crews to bail out rather than fight on in exposed terrain. In other words, the Abrams has not failed because its armor is weak. It has struggled because it is operating without the logistical and overwhelming air majority backbone it was designed to depend on. The destruction rate percentage for the Abrams is tougher to call. If we look at just the initial American delivery, it's 30%, as the Australian tanks are just now getting into action. No Abrams has been lost since Australia started its deliveries, so it's clear, as with the other tanks, that after the initial surge in losses, Ukraine has adapted. Finally, at the lighter end of Ukraine's armored fleet sits the Leopard 1, a tank that was never intended to go toe-to-toe with modern Russian armor, yet has still found a useful niche on the battlefield. Well over 100 have been delivered, many of them refurbished after long storage, and while they lack the heavy protection of the Leopard 2 or Challenger 2, their excellent optics and accurate 105mm gun give them real value as a mobile fire support platform. Rather than serving as breakthrough tanks, Leopard 1s are increasingly used more like self-propelled guns, firing from covered positions, supporting infantry with long-range, accurate fire, and avoiding direct duels with Russian tanks or drone-saturated killing grounds. Oryx's visually confirmed data shows a relatively modest number lost, some destroyed, some damaged, a few abandoned, but nowhere near the attrition rate seen among frontline heavy armor. That low loss rate reflects how commanders are using them, cautiously, sparingly, and in roles that play to their strengths. But it was worth a mention in any case, as it is still a tank in the same generation as the T-64, and many Leopard 1 hulls have been used to attach other systems, like the Leopard, Skyranger, and putting other turrets on. In Ukraine, it's being called the Frankentank for this very reason. So, to summarize and rate the Western tanks in Ukraine, let's start by looking at the overall destruction rates stacked against each other. I'll leave the Leopard 1 out initially as this is used in a totally different role. And yes, before you go into the comments and say you can't compare them because they're all used on different parts of the front. Yes, I agree, but most of these tanks have been rotated around the whole of Ukraine and have logged thousands of active hours. Even if our comparison won't be 100% accurate, it is a good baseline to start from. As you can see, both Leopard 2 models and the Abrams stand out as the worst performing in drone-saturated warfare, and that is mainly due to the weakness surrounding the armor outside the transmission and frontal armor. While the overall winner is the up-tooled Stridsvagn, the challengers are also performing well. The producers of the Leopard have already addressed these issues in their later models, and are likely working closely with the Swedes when it comes to improving the Leopard 2 against drones. None of these tanks have active protection like the trophy system, which is due to be active on just about every modern Western tank, which would likely reduce these figures substantially. So, to rate them on our chart, I'm going to have to put the Stridsvagn in the top spot, followed by the Challenger. The overperforming tank on the list is the Polish Twardy, which for the age it has is doing better than all its Soviet cousins by a country mile due to the Polish upgrades that has been done to it. Both Leopard 2 models and the Abrams haven't been all that, probably due to Ukraine using them for attacks rather than defense. The tank was initially made to stay back and destroy Russian armor charges, and Ukraine used it to try to breach defenses in its failed summer southern counterattack. Loss figures have gone down after Ukraine reverted it to the role it was designed for. The Leopard 1 is a great utility weapon for Ukraine, and has been pivotal when it comes to using the hulls for air defense turrets and other roles. Now, before Germany decides to invade Finland to trial me for heresy, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, if you like this video, it'd be an honor if you'd hit that like and subscribe button. Have a great weekend.